Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the new Sigma 17mm f4 DGDN lens. This is part of their iSeries, the latest entry in the iSeries, and it is an incredibly small, wide-angle option that manages to deliver highly detailed images despite the compact size. The great challenge here is that this tiny lens retails for about $600 US, which is going to raise the question, is it worth the cash? Well, find out after a word from our sponsor today.
Today's episode is brought to you by Into the AM, a clothing brand from Southern California that wants to outfit your passion, whatever it might be. Their everyday comfortable fabrics and designs are great whether you are working from home, working out, or even just chilling out. I love the fit and fabric on their everyday t-shirts, and you can choose more funky styles created in collaboration with local artists like this killer Fractured King hoodie. Use the code Dustin10 or follow the link in the description to get 10% off site-wide, including their monthly t-shirt club. Visit intotheam.com/Dustin10 for more information.
So far, Sigma's iSeries has branched out into two kind of distinct lines. One of those being the lenses with a maximum aperture of f2, which are slightly larger, very good optically typically. And then there is some really small options that we have seen thus far. A 24mm f3.5, a 45mm f2.8, and a 90mm f2.8, and then this lens, a 17mm f4. Now, while it has the smallest maximum aperture of any lens in the iSeries so far, it also has by far the widest angle of view. It's a 103.7 degree angle of view, which is quite wide. But this lens isn't small like, say, Canon 16mm f2.8 STM. It's not a plastic fantastic. This is a really premium lens. It has a really beautiful build quality and overall aesthetic to it. It just happens to be really, really small. It's only 64mm in diameter with a 55mm front filter thread. It's right under 51mm in length. So think 2.5 inches by only 2 inches in length, and it weighs in at 220 grams or 7.8 ounces. The fact that the weight of it is so light tells you how small the lens is, because this is, as noted, a premium build. It's all metal construction here, up to and including the lens hood. The lens hood is really, really beautifully crafted, and I love the fact that when it is mounted, all of the vertical lines on here, the ribs on here, all line up, and it just looks like the lens hood is an extension of the lens design rather than some, tacked on plastic piece that looks like an afterthought. As has been typical for this series, we do have an aperture ring, and so 1/3 stop detents and marks at the full aperture stops. There is no declick option here, and outside of the AF/MF switch on the side, there are also no further features, no focus hold button or anything like that. I will note that while some of the lenses in this series have a kind of transversely mounted AF/MF switch, this one doesn't, and frankly I wish that it did, mostly because it is so small and because the aperture ring is raised, there is very little space, just a couple of millimeters between the aperture ring and then that switch, and so I find that it's just a little bit difficult to feel it and get my finger in on there, and so if it's hard to do with my bare hands, I can only imagine trying to do it with gloves in the winter. So, obviously, I think it would have worked better if it had been oriented in the other direction. It's not, so that's neither here nor there. There is a gasket at the rear of the lens. However, as has been typical for the iSeries, the only weather sealing is the gasket itself. There are no internal seals, no, flooring type coating on the front. And so it's a very basic weather sealing that is engaged. We have a very, very nice manual focus ring. Now again, there's not a lot of distance between the manual focus ring and the lens hood, part of the byproduct of such a very small design. However, there is really, really quality damping to the focus ring to where it actually feels like it has some weight to it and feels more precise in focus. Two different caps, as is typical for the iSeries. It leverages the fact that everything is metal. One of those caps is magnetic. It works fine if you don't have the lens hood on. If you do, there's not a lot of room in there to get you have to almost use a fingernail to pry it up. And so I find the pinch cap just more straightforward, even if it doesn't feel maybe as premium as what the metal cap does. 7 rounded aperture blades inside. As far as keeping a circular shape, it does a reasonable job, but as you can see, the geometry is never really all that exceptional. We'll explain a little bit why in the breakdown of the image quality in just a moment. One final thing to note about the build and the handling is that the minimum focus distance is only 12 centimeters. Now, from the sensor to the front of the lens hood is over 9 centimeters, so you're almost on top of your subject by that. You're going to want to remove the lens hood if you're going to try to operate at the minimum focus distance. But there you do have a very reasonable 0.28, almost 0.28 times magnification, which is really useful, though, as we'll see in the IQ breakdown. It does take a little bit of a deft hand to make sure that you get images that look good as a byproduct, because you're so close and there is some distortion in the lens itself. Now, autofocus here comes from an STM or stepping focus motor. That's typical throughout the iSeries, and frankly, this is probably the least challenging lens in the series. It has the smallest maximum aperture, it has the widest focal length. As a byproduct, that means that a lot is going to be in focus most of the time, and so the focus motor is not overly taxed, elements are not big, and it doesn't have to do a lot of major focus changes. So as a byproduct, autofocus is snappy, it's quiet, no issues there at all. In fact, I found that it actually worked just fine for sports, even though, once again, there's probably not a whole lot of focus change taking place, but at the same time, seem to have no problem keeping up with the action in a pickup basketball game there. I also found in just shooting images of Nala with her moving towards the camera, which can be difficult, that it grabbed her eye, and as long as I had my shutter speed up high enough, which takes a little bit more work with an f4 maximum aperture, but as long as I did that, I was able to get nicely focused results, no issues there. I also had good eye stickiness on my eye from my hand test, and as you can see, once my hand was out of the way, it very quickly and smoothly returned to the eye. And furthermore, when I did my focus pulls test, focus pulls are nice, smooth. They're not abrupt, but they are fast because, again, there's not a major amount of focus change that is taking place. And as a fringe benefit, there's next to no focus breathing that is taking place there either, which is always useful because these third-party lenses are not going to be compatible with Sony's focus breathing compensation, but in this case, it's not really needed. I will note that this lens sells not only in a Sony E mount, but also a Leica L mount. And some of the limitations that are on Sony don't exist on Leica for the simple reason that on Leica, Sigma is actually one of the parties, kind of first parties in that consortium, and so it technically is a first party lens there, so there's no limitations that are imposed on it like there are on Sony. The other limitation, potential limitation, is the fact that on the sports bodies, maximum burst rate is going to be 15 frames per second, as it is with all third-party lenses, and so you won't be able to get either 20 frames per second on the A9 series or 30 frames per second on the Alpha 1. Probably not a huge deal for most people in most situations. I will also note that there was good overall focus speed and precision throughout my test. I have no complaints about autofocus. And when it comes to image quality, for such a tiny optic, while there are a few flaws, as we're going to see, overall this is a very strong performer. It is a very sharp lens. And so let's dive in, and much like the 24mm f3.5, I wasn't excited by an f3.5 aperture. I'm not particularly excited by an f4 aperture, though it's a little easier to swallow in a wide-angle lens like this. But as we're going to see, you've got plenty of sharpness on tap, even from wide open at f4. Let's dive in, let's take a look.
So first off, we'll take a look at vignette and distortion. I had a fear with such a small lens that distortion would be an issue along with vignette, and certainly that is the case here, though I do want to put it in some context. So as we can see, there is some strong barrel distortion. When I did a manual correction, and I'll show you those stats in just a moment, you can see that there's a little bit of a mustache pattern that is left behind, so not a perfect correction. We'll take a quick look at those numbers. So to achieve the degree of correction that I did, I dialed in a plus 12 for the distortion, which you can see that's flattened it out in the corners. There's still that bulge in the center. What happens if you go further with that correction is you'll see start to turn to some pincushion distortion, except for then it flattens out in the middle. And so it's just, it's not a linear type distortion. So it's really kind of hard to dial in something perfect there. Vignette is a plus 78, and so about 3 stops. So, heavy for sure, though not off the charts heavy. So without any kind of vignette correction, what you'll end up with is, a fairly heavy kind of focus in towards the center of the image because that vignette is strong in the corners, but it is pretty linear, so it moves out quite a ways. So in an image like this, this is a look. And so either it might work in some images. In this particular one, I think that it does work, but in other situations, it's obviously not going to work at all. And so if you had a lot of, for example, snow here in the foreground, you really don't want a lot of darkening there. But, this kind of vignette sometimes can achieve a certain look that people like, but in many cases, you're going to want to have it corrected. So there is a correction profile available both in camera for JPEG and video, and then here for a raw image in post-processing software. So you can see that it does a much cleaner job of giving a linear correction to which is much more even, though it does come at a slight cost of reducing some of the image size. So if we go back and look at the original, what I saw in the viewfinder is I would be seeing a corrected JPEG typically in the viewfinder. And so in that case, I would have been, usually what I do is I box in this outer lines, just try to make that as square as I can in the viewfinder. So you can see that there was some leftover room left for correction. And then after correction, you can definitely see that we have kind of zoomed in. We've cropped in a little bit further, though it's nothing extreme. I mentioned putting things in perspective. Here is another fairly recent lens. Last year, Canon released a 16mm f2.8, so fairly similar, a very compact wide-angle prime lens. You can see that the distortion is just off the charts by comparison to the Sigma. Again, in the viewfinder, this was actually framed right around these lines, but the raw image leaves this much room for correction because it's needed, as you can see here on the right, to try to get back to some semblance of straight lines. And so there's a tremendous amount of crop that comes after that correction to get to that place. And so while the Sigma definitely has some distortion here, it's nowhere near what I've seen either from this Canon. And then a few years back, Tamron released a 20mm f2.8 on the Sony platform as well. And it had basically double what the Sigma had. So, it's bad, but it's not as bad as what some of the alternatives are for sure. And you are going to want to correct that in many situations. Even in an image like this, you can see that there's just kind of a lean to the fence that is along here. And so after the correction, it's just straightened all of that out, though it does come at the cost of just a little bit of stretching there at the edges. And you can also see the difference in the sky with the vignette correction, that it's not nearly as heavy down here in the corners. Things have lightened up. So you're going to get a little bit more of a look into the corners, obviously, and just an overall different look to images post-correction. This is kind of an extreme example here, but getting fairly close to this building with lots of vertical lines here. You can definitely see that barrel distortion. So after correction, the lines are better, though at the cost of the image looking very slightly unnatural. I would say I would want to do even more perspective to correction to make that look a little bit more natural. Bottom line is that this is not going to be a top choice for things like real estate, where you really need those straight lines because it does have a fair bit of distortion. So moving on to some other things. Here, when it comes to things like longitudinal chromatic aberration, often not a problem with a lens like this. There's not a lot typically out of focus. You can see just the faintest bit of some green fringing around this specular highlight, but we don't see a lot of that fringing either here or in these kind of bright transition areas on the facets of that. So really not a bad result there. Likewise, if we take a look at the edge of the frame here on my test chart, you can see good transitions there. And this is without any kind of correction, so you can see not a lot of fringing. And if I switch to a real-world example, this is like a perfect breeding ground for lateral chromatic aberrations near the edge of the frame. So many of these high-contrast bare branches. And so we can see just a tiny bit of some magenta, purple fringing here, but really this is not bad at all. This is well-controlled, and this is the kind that's very easy to remove what very little bit there is. Now, I have noted in some of my recent text reviews that Sigma has done a pretty remarkable job in that when they release a new lens, we pretty much all expect that it is going to be a very sharp lens. They've developed a reputation for that. They did not let us down here either. We have a even on my 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1, we can see at 200% magnification in the center of the frame at f4, this lens has tons of pop, sharpness, contrast. It's all there. We can see in the mid-frame looks exceptionally good. And if we pop down towards the corner, we can see that the corners are also very strong. And if I do just a quick pan across here, taking a look at some other areas, we can see very, very good result there. If I pop out for a second and go over and see the queen, we can see that we look sharp over on this side. And finally, if I pop up even up to the upper left corner, we can see it's very sharp up here as well. And so we see a very consistent, very well-centered result all across the frame. Now stepping down to f5.6, as you can see, it doesn't really make much of a difference in the center of the frame. Center of the frame was already very, very good. Likewise, in the mid frame, I don't see a lot of improvement. If I go down to the corner here, I do see some improvement primarily to the contrast, which just allows the textures to be better defined and look a little bit brighter. I can also see just a mild improvement over here on this side when it comes to that corner performance. But obviously already very, very strong from wide open, so there's only marginal room for improvement. From f5.6 to f8, again in the center of the frame, not a lot of improvement to see there. Mid-frame already very good. Still a little bit of improvement there in the corner, and I don't see any kind of regression in the middle or the mid-frame result. And so as a byproduct, I don't think diffraction is really costing us much yet, so I would go up to f8. Beyond that, if you're on a high-resolution body, you probably will see some effects of diffraction as you go beyond this point. Obviously, the most severe example will be at the minimum aperture of f22, and as you can see here, diffraction has cost us a lot. A lot of contrast has gone. The ability to render the fine details has been affected by diffraction. And so I would use f11 as an upper limit here, and for the most part, if you can stay at f8 between, I would say f5.6 and f8, you're going to get your peak performance across the frame for that. So as noted, our minimum focus distance is a very close 12 or 13 centimeters. And so that means you are pretty much on top of your subject at minimum focus distance. Byproduct here, I think we're a little over 9 centimeters from the sensor to the front of the lens with the lens hood attached. So you're going to want to remove the lens hood in most of these situations. And you can see that as a byproduct, we definitely, between the distortion and being so close, you're definitely not going to get a very flat plane of focus. We can see that the contrast and detail is quite good up close. So this is useful, but it's going to have to be used in a wise way because it's going to be easy to either get a lot of distortion or just kind of a weird result. If you do get very close, as we can see here after an ice storm, kind of a late winter, early spring ice storm, you can see that you can achieve somewhat interesting result here, blur out the background to some degree. This is a little bit better where there's more separation from the foreground to the background. And also you can see it's a very nice and crisp end result here. Just know that at 17 millimeters and only a maximum aperture of f4, you're going to have to really choose your spots for getting a defocused background. Here's another example where I'm not quite as close to the subject. The background is a little bit further away, so you can see there are some, specular highlights up there, bokeh balls. But you can also see here in the transition area, it's a little busy. I mean, that's not really what this lens is about. It's not a great strength for it. What this lens really thrives at, obviously, is going to be having lots in focus. And so in this case, in this shot, we can see in the early morning, this is actually part of a time lapse that you've already seen at this point, that you can see that it's producing really, really nice detail just all across the frame. And our advantage is going to be that, for example, in an image like this, we can take a look down here in the foreground. That is in focus and there's detail there. Obviously, the midground, there is plenty in detail. And then off into the distance, even towards infinity, there continues to be lots of detail. And that's only at f5.6. So rather than getting things out of focus, the advantage of a lens like this is that without going into too small of an aperture, you can get a lot in focus all at the same time. And we've already seen here just looking at the geometry, but if we take a look at this once again, you can see that there's definitely some distortion, stretching of specular highlights towards the corner of the frame. And as we stop down, it's trying to maintain a circular aperture, but you can just see that that's just really not the strength here. There's only 7 aperture blades, so those are starting to show up, obviously, at this point. But primarily, it's the stretching towards the edges that keep us from really having a lot of truly circular, specular highlights on a lens like this. I felt like overall color and contrast was really good, and so the images have quite a lot of pop to them. You can see here that detail is really great and crisp. Colors are nice and bright here. Overall, a really nice looking end result. And finally, a real strength for the lens is its flare resistance, which is great in such a small optic. And so here, very bright sun, obviously, as you can see, reflected off very bright snow as it starts to melt away. But I mean, this is about all we've got in terms of any kind of ghosting artifact. Then stopping it on down and composing in a different way. Once again, we can see that that's about all. And the contrast obviously has remained really strong. So a really great result there. The one thing I will say is that I actually found it a little bit hard to get kind of a sunburst effect with this lens. This should be a fairly good situation for doing that. And it just seemed like the blades were never super well defined. Again, that's about as all we've got for ghosting. So this is definitely a lens that you don't have to hesitate to fire into the sun. Very, very good flare resistance. Overall, quite a good performance for such a compact little wide-angle lens.
So obviously there is some significant distortion and some vignette there to deal with, but overall the performance makes this lens intriguing. Intriguing because it is so small with such a wide angle of view, but it is such a high-performing optic, producing such very sharp images with great contrast and color, good flare resistance, all of those things. And so I think the biggest strength here is that this lens is so compact. It's going to be an easy way to bring along a very wide perspective, maybe to complement other lenses. And that's the way that I look at and kind of value a lens like this. That, say I'm going out with a zoom, it means if I was making a choice between a wide-angle zoom and a standard zoom, well, I could grab a standard zoom. You could pair it with a 24 or 28 to 70 millimeter lens from Sigma. Thinking about that, this gives you a much wider perspective to balance with that. And so you can bring that along very easy in a pocket or very easily in the bag. But the flip side of that is a lens that is so small is going to have a challenge when it comes to price perception. A small premium lens is a little bit harder to market than a big premium lens. It seems like you're getting more for your money with a larger aperture lens. And so the fact that this lens has a small maximum aperture, on paper, it's not particularly exciting. A 17 millimeter f4 lens for $600, it's not blowing anybody's mind. But I think that in practice, this lens makes a lot of sense. And of course, it's going to make even more sense if you're really wanting to travel light. And for example, on some of the smaller, L-mount bodies, it's going to make a lot of sense. On a Sony A7C or something similar, it's going to make a whole lot of sense. And of course, it is a very high-performing lens and wide enough that it even makes some sense on APS-C, where you get about a 25.5 millimeter angle of view, which is still a very, very useful point of view. So at the end of the day, I do think there's going to be a market for this lens, but I recognize it's not necessarily going to be for everyone. And not everyone is willing to spend a premium price for a premium lens, particularly one that is so small. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you will find linkage there to my full text review, also to an image gallery, so you can check out more photos there. There are some buying links if you'd like to purchase one, links to follow myself or Craig on social media. You can become a patron, get channel merchandise, and of course, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.